Good evening all, and welcome. Tonight we've got an extra long series of stories for you, a collection about sleep paralysis and nightmares, and I assure you this can be a lot more horrifying than you expect. I'd also like to thank Storytime Cinema for collaborating with us on this video. If you'd like to watch more of their content, you can find a link in the description and at the end of the video. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I've always had incidents with paranormal activity, but this one story still baffles me and everyone involved to this day. Just thinking about it now gives me goosebumps. For a bit of background info, this occurred in Lake City, Florida. My husband and I found the perfect house for our family of 5 in 2007. It was a huge 2,000 plus square foot mobile home on 5 acres, 4 bedrooms with 2 baths. It was amazingly within our budget, only $830 a month and rent to own. So we signed the contract assuming the low price was due to it being in the middle of nowhere. Our 3 kids were 9 months, 3 years, and 5 years old at the time. The older 2 were ecstatic to finally have a room of their own, but this was short-lived after moving in. From the very beginning, we were all a bit anxious in the house, but we kept saying it was due to the large size of the home. We moved from a very small 2-bedroom apartment, and it being located so far out in the middle of nowhere in the country, plus it being a new house, period. It started by us noticing lights on that we knew were supposed to be off, doors being open that were supposed to be closed and vice versa, bumps in the middle of the night with no explanation. The kids all started having night terrors, and after about a week, we discovered the older 2 kids asleep on the 9-month-old's floor beside her crib. They started doing this every night. My 5-year-old daughter had such bad dreams one night it caused her to vomit. She came in crying and throwing up, saying there was a man on fire floating outside her window. She was truly terrified. Back then I worked night shift, and my husband was the one dealing with the freaky incidents at home at night. After several months of various incidents, my husband had to go out of town for 2 weeks due to his job. They were going to build a house in Steinhatchee, Florida. Since I was working night shift, the kids were shipped off to the grandparents. This event happens on the first night of my 2 days off, and my mum said she'd keep the kids for an extra night so I could catch up on some much needed sleep. Now, backing up. The town my husband was working in did not have cell reception for our carrier, and the only place he could get service to call was in the town standing in a very specific location, so he couldn't call from the job site or the house they were staying in, and I rarely got to speak to him while he was gone. He literally had to drive into town, stand next to one of those large ice cream maker machines, which he discovered by accident one morning while getting their cooler ice for the day, that his phone randomly downloaded all his missed texts, so he figured he got service while standing there specifically. On my first night alone in this house, I was truly scared after several hours of hearing things. Here I am, beyond exhausted from barely getting any sleep the week before, and I can't sleep because of the house noises. I went out to the couch and decided to try and fall asleep with the TV way up loud to drown out the noises. I carried a weapon under my pillow and another one next to me, and felt safe enough to fall asleep. At 3 a.m., a call wakes me up. I looked at the screen and it said, "My baby," aka husband. I answered. He was in a panic. "Honey, are you okay?" "Yeah, I'm fine. Why?" He's freaking out, telling me he had a nightmare. He asked if I was asleep on the couch. He asked if I had a weapon under my pillow and another one next to me, saying specifically what they were. He asked what I was wearing. and I said yes to all his questions. He even confirmed the direction my head was. This were all things that he should not have known, considering we hadn't spoken a number of days. He's all but hysterical at one point, saying he had a nightmare where a man broke in and did horrific things to me before ending my life. Any other time I would have called him crazy and told him I was staying put, but there was something about his voice and the desperation that got me out of the house. At this point I decided to leave, especially considering how out of character it was for him. And I heard a bang coming from the opposite end of the house. My blood runs cold. It was almost like a bad omen. Since he's not the type to normally act like this, I panic and make him stay on the phone with me while I grabbed the car keys and my purse. I hit the button on the car to turn on the lights and make a run to the car. I got the hell out of there, not bothering to change clothes or grab anything. Once he verified that I was on the road safe, he said he'd call me tomorrow and check on things. I then called my mum to let her know I'm coming, and I tell her the story of how this all came to be. I drove the 45 minutes to her house, shaking the entire way. After arriving, and some time talking to her, I settle in and fall asleep. I tried calling my husband in the morning, but kept getting voicemail. That's completely normal for the town he's working in. At this point, I must go to the house to grab clothes and a few bits. I made my mum go with me because I was still freaked out by everything, and there was no way I was going back there alone. When we get there, I immediately noticed the screen had been cut and the window was broken out. Picture a normal double-wide mobile home with a large deck and a window on either side of the door. The window that was broke out was the one right next to the door. I called the police immediately. They cleared the house and walked through with me to see if anything was missing and to add to the report. There wasn't. I wouldn't have known if someone had been in there if it hadn't been for the screen and window being broken. I tried to call my husband, but couldn't get through to him, and after leaving several voicemails, he finally called. I told him that his weird nightmare just might have saved my life, and explained everything to him. He's completely at a loss and asked me what the hell I was talking about, that he hadn't called me. I froze. Yes you did. He's adamant he didn't. He says he didn't have a nightmare, nor did he call, and we argue for several minutes because I knew he called. How could he? When he said when he was at home all night, and he only got cell service in one place. That hadn't even crossed my mind at that point. I told him to check his call logs. He didn't have any outgoing calls. My phone, however, showed that I had received a call from my baby at 3 a.m. I sent him a screenshot of my phone, and he has no recollection of ever calling or of the nightmare. I'll never forget the panic in his voice, the desperation for me to leave, the details he couldn't have known. Who called me and saved my life that night? The police didn't find any fingerprints or anything that could lead to an arrest. We ended up moving out very soon after, because we didn't feel safe, especially when we were dealing with a haunting at the same time. I spoke to 2 of our neighbors, and they said no one ever leased it for more than 6 months. Where I'm stuck is who called.
The room where I was laying in my comfortable bed was completely dark, the only exception being the few times when the lightning flashed. The storm was so violent that it seemed impossible for me to fall asleep, with all the loud thunder blasting in my ear and fierce winds slamming the tree branches into my window. Even though outside was almost freezing, inside was totally the opposite. It was very hot, and I thought that maybe this was the reason for my insomnia. So without thinking twice, I uncovered one leg and immediately fell asleep. At one point, I woke up from a deep sleep when I felt something grab my leg. I slowly opened my eyes and raised my head. That's when I saw it. It was a horrific creature with a wide smile and long, dirty claws. At that moment, I simply froze. I was unable to make a sound, and I couldn't feel anything. The next thing I remember is that it dragged me under the bed, and then I woke up again. It was just a nightmare. I felt relieved. Then I looked at the door and saw a silhouette standing in front of it. I was lucky that my dog started barking and probably startled it. The thing vanished into thin air. Sometimes in stormy nights, I still see that smile. Other times I see the whole creature, just staring at me. But I always make sure that I'm tucked in and it leaves me alone. I wonder how long it will last.
This dream has stayed with me, and I think it always will. Although not profound or life-altering, I've never been able to shake the memory and the feeling of absolute terror and dread. To give some context, this was a number of years ago. Currently, I'm 23 years old, and this dream occurred at the age of 11. As a child, I suffered from sleep paralysis for a number of years. At first, this terrified me to the point of me not wanting to sleep. It became so bad that I pushed myself to states of exhaustion before my body could no longer remain conscious and I would pass out, only to return to the horrifying imagery of my subconscious. The first time I ever experienced sleep paralysis, I still lived with my aunt who fostered me, which is another story entirely. But I was in my old room in my old bunk bed, and I remember it all so clearly. I awake to the sensation of not being able to move, struggle as I may, and this confused me, but didn't scare me, not yet. It was only when I saw what stood in the corner of the room did my fear really start to descend. It was a hooded figure, all black, so very black, darker than the darkest shade of black. In its hand was some kind of weapon, like an oddly shaped axe or scythe. Its face was that of a skeleton, ghostly white, and dark black holes that felt as though they were sucking the life straight out of you, where his eyes should have been. It stood there, staring at me. My eyes widened as I prayed for this to be some kind of dream or hallucination. I was frozen in fear, not that I could escape, even if I had the courage to move. Its sharp, crooked, daggered teeth began to form a smile, the most gut-wrenching, heart-stopping smile I could ever imagine. The kind of smile that alludes to such confidence, such domination and power over me, that it only frightened me more and intensified my fear. It slowly, creakily, almost clockwork doll-like began to turn its head, continuing until it was such at an unnatural angle, and then it started to inch towards me. It didn't walk, it simply began to move closer. It didn't obey any natural law or any flicker of logic. I guess in retrospect it makes perfect sense, just adding to my confusion. It edged even closer to me, unmoving and unchanging in its deadlock, icy grin, its gaze of absolute horror still peering into my soul. Looking back, I can still picture it, and it disgusts me. It continued until it was halfway across the room. Then, without warning, it just stopped. This is where my blood ran cold. It slowly raised its arms from beneath its cloak to reveal its hideous, revolting arm, a mixture of rotting flesh on bone, decomposing right there in front of me, and the sight of it made me want to gag. Then it did something I'll never forget. It methodically raised its hand slowly, that putrid thing, and began to point. Not at something in the room, but at me. My eyes widened further still, and my heart began to thump in my chest. It then placed both hands upon his head and begun to twist and pull his head back into place. The noise sent shivers down my spine. It creaked and cracked and screamed back into place, and then the figure began to approach me. It was at this point full-blown panic set in, and I started to struggle. I kicked and twisted and tried to throw my body, but I could not. I couldn't move. I was trapped and paralyzed as the ominous creature drew ever closer. I couldn't free my invisible shackles. So I screamed with all my might. I thought at the very least my family would be alerted. At the very least, they'd surely see what happened to me, for whatever small comfort that may bring. But to my dismay, no sound came from my mouth. I tried again, but now the figure was almost at the foot of my bed. My cries for help failed. In my head, I was screaming like a madman. The figure was now at the foot of my bed, only now it's not smiling, but it looks more terrifying, teeth all aligned jaggedly. I continued to struggle, but it was futile. It continued to get closer and closer until it was stood right in front of me at the side of my bed. I was frozen. I just looked back at it, petrified. It leaned in until its face was face to face with me, and at this point I knew my life was over. It reached its arm towards me, and it screamed a blood-curdling scream. I closed my eyes and prepared myself to be ripped apart by this thing. But no, nothing. Just like that, it was gone. I look around my room with my heart thumping so hard I thought it would burst from my ribcage. I was sweating profusely, and I was afraid. I scanned the room, but it was empty. I turned on the light. Nothing. I crawled back into bed, confused and fearful. No more sleep was had the next night, and the light remained on. The previous night's ordeal haunted me the next day, and I couldn't focus. I tried to talk with my aunt, but she put it down to a bad dream, maybe a demon that had taken a liking. The latter was her way of trying to be funny and reassure me that it wasn't real, but I didn't find it comforting in the slightest. In fact, it made me more paranoid, and I dreaded going back to bed that night. When night came, I wasn't prepared, and I decided I wouldn't sleep in fear of what I saw returning. I tried my hardest, but eventually my struggles resulted in failure. It was no good. My eyes became heavy and tears started to stream down my face. Whatever that thing was had shaken me to my very core. It might sound silly to some, but I genuinely believed that when I fell back asleep, my life would be in serious danger. I sobbed and cried myself to sleep, and the next morning I awoke and I was fine. No figure, no traumatic experience at all. And this filled me with so much joy than ever before. Maybe it had just been a dream. Maybe I didn't have to face this thing. It was exhilarating. Later on, I would learn about sleep paralysis, as I did end up suffering from it for quite a few years, and ended up doing some research which confirmed it to be nothing more than sleep-related hallucinations. Even when they would return several times as I returned to sleep, eventually I did discover something useful, something to help you escape, even if it's just temporarily. The trick is to move. I know you probably think, well, that's useful considering you're legitimately paralyzed, hence the name sleep paralysis. But there's something many people fail to consider. Yes, it's true you can't move your arms or legs or even your head. You can't scream or make a sound. But what you can do is move your tongue. It sounds silly, but move your tongue as much as possible and as quickly as possible. And if you try and waggle those fingertips and toes at the same time, you'll wake up much faster. Maybe there's someone hearing this who's suffering from sleep paralysis. Maybe there's people listening who already know this and don't believe it would work. But if you're suffering, and the once tranquil thought of sleep has been replaced with the fear of what awaits you, then give it a try. It may just help.
When I was 19, my BFF, let's call her Sarah, died in a car crash. I was devastated, and it took months until I could go a single day without crying. 3 months later to the date, I feel really tired and take a nap. I never nap. I dreamt that I was visiting my friend Rachel's house. In my dream, Rachel and her husband Mark moved into Sarah's old house, which was my old house when I was younger in real life. We were all hanging out and I said, "Wouldn't it be weird if Sarah haunted us?" They laughed at me and told me to grow up. I spent the night there, and late at night, Sarah showed up as a ghost. She told me to meet her at the train station at 7:30 p.m. the next day because she had something to tell me. I wake up, in my dream, and tell my friends. They say it was a dream, but still take me to the train station at the time. At 7:30 exactly, Sarah shows up just like she said she would. My friends can see her, but she says she'll only talk to me. I go up and she says, "I'm so sorry I never got to say goodbye. I love you so much. Please do me a favor and tell my family and friends I said goodbye and I love them and I'm sorry." I say I will. I'm crying and ask her if we can hug. She says she doesn't know, but we can try. And we do it, and it works. I woke up in real life crying and had been crying. In fact, my friend Laura had woken me up because I was crying so hard in my dream. That's not the end of it. My friend Laura and I had to go to City Hall that day to get our Social Security cards for our new jobs. We lost ours, and while we are in the waiting room, there is a mother and her young daughter. Her daughter was very friendly and adorable, ran around playing with her dolls, would come up and talk to us, and the entire time Laura and I would look at each other with the look in our eyes that this girl looks just like Sarah when she was younger. Eventually, I asked the girl her name and she replies, "My name is Sarah." Laura and I both kind of freaked out. Same day, Laura and I have to go to Rite Aid to get our pictures developed. The lady who handed us our developed pictures had the same exact ring on that Sarah owned, and Sarah's ring was very rare with only 50 of them ever being made, so that was a bit freaky. A few months later, I'm living about 4 hours north of where my story first started, but Laura stayed there. I had a dream that I was at Rachel's house, her parents' house this time, which is in the middle of the woods, and there are a few of us, including Rachel, her husband Mark, Laura, and others I can't remember. We decide to go on a late-night drive. It's dark and I'm driving, and can only see the road that the headlights are on, when all of a sudden someone runs across the road almost hitting us. I hit the brakes, skidding a bit, turning the car to face where the person was, and there was a girl sitting on a small boulder, and it was Sarah. I get out of the car and yell at her, "What are you doing?" She replies, "What do you mean?" I say, "You're dead." She looks at me with her head tilting and says, "Oh," and I woke up. Later that day, Laura calls me and we are talking for a good hour. After a bit, I mention the dream. I say, "I had a dream about Sarah last night. It was odd." Laura replies, "Weird, so did I. You tell me yours first." So I do, and I get to the part where we decide to go on a late night drive, and Laura goes, "Shut the up." And she proceeds to describe the entire dream verbatim. We had the same exact dream on the same exact night, at the same exact time in our own roles. It's been 16 years since Sarah passed, and I hadn't told anyone besides Laura about my dreams on our shared experiences, because I was too afraid of opening wounds, hurting someone, or them thinking I was being a dick, basically. Sarah's family and I were always close, and still are. But like I said, I didn't know how long was long enough to mention it. But about a year ago, I finally called Sarah's mom and told her everything. I started out with, "I need to tell you something, and I know it will be hard for the both of us, but I promised her I would, and I'm so sorry it took so long. I just wanted it to be right, and I'm sorry if I waited too long, but I believe Sarah wanted me to give you a message." And I told her everything. Sarah's mom, let's call her Tina, cried a lot, but she said she felt like it was a huge relief for her. She explained to me that ever since, her and her family were trying to contact her in some way. They waited for a dream, or her ghost to do or say something, but no one ever did. She 100% believes that Sarah talked to me, and the reason me and not her family is because they wanted it to happen too much and couldn't trust themselves with the truth. I'm not sure if it was real. I'm not even sure if I believe in that sort of thing, but I really hope it was real. Sarah's mom was upset, but in a good way, and thanked me. That's my real-life experience.
This is something that happened to me in 2014, about 2 weeks after my dad passed away. I am a 39-year-old female, originally from Miami, Florida, and I've been living in the Hudson Valley area of New York for about 6 years, when in February of 2014, my 59-year-old seemingly fit and seemingly healthy father was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer that had spread to his liver. I was devastated. As being a registered nurse, I knew there was no hope. My dad decided to take the chemotherapy treatment against his better judgment because my mum, brother, and myself were so distraught that we begged him to try as we prayed for a miracle. After 7 months of feeling sick and making little to no progress as had been expected, my dad, mum, and the doctor came to the decision my dad would be placed on a hospice, and it was time for me to fly back home and spend my dad's last days with him at the house and surrounded by our large and supportive extended family. I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to tell my father how much I loved him and what a perfect father he had always been to me. 2 days of being on hospice care, all around the clock morphine, my dad fell into an almost coma-like state, where he would not open his eyes and barely moved. The next 5 days were full of anxiety, sadness, and at times desperation. We didn't want to lose him, but we didn't want for him to suffer anymore. Finally, after 7 days of being home on hospice, on a beautiful and sunny Miami day, my dad passed away surrounded by family. I was always extremely close to my dad, and at that moment, it was surreal for me. I let out the pain and emotions I had been keeping in for the past week, in the form of loud, anguished sobs as I hugged his dead body and kissed his face and head. My dad was gone. About a week later, after ensuring my mum and younger brother were okay, as could be expected, I flew back to New York, as I had work and my children and husband needed me. I was in a fog of sadness and disbelief as I tried to get back to my routine. 2 weeks after my dad's passing, I found myself in a dream where my mum and brother and I were walking in an indoor place with lots of people from different parts of the world walking around and talking to each other. There was a river that ran through the place, and I and my mum and brother followed it until it reached a bend, and upon trying right to continue following it, my dad appears in front of us. He looked young, healthy, and radiantly glowing. His beautiful green eyes were healthy again, so bright, and I yelled in absolute joy, "Dad, I miss you so much." We hugged and then began to speak telepathically, not using words. It's a bit difficult to explain, but basically our communication was entirely through feelings and in our mind, but no words were exchanged. I simply understood what he was conveying to me, and he understood me the same way. This is what he expressed to me. "I don't look like this anymore. I came to you in this way so that you'd recognize me. I knew the family was all there, but I missed my brother. Tell Jay that not all of them are good and to not give his light to just anyone." It's important to understand here that my dad's brother was not present during my father's last 2 days because he was in prison and wasn't due to be released for at least another year. The two had grown up very close because they had been abandoned on the family farm in Cuba to be raised by relatives as my grandmother moved to Havana to start a new life. Regarding Jay, he's my little brother and my dad's youngest son. He had been doing drugs and spending time with bad people, and although we didn't know the extent of his involvement in this type of lifestyle, we knew he was potentially in danger. Although smart and spunky, Jay has always been kind-hearted and sees the best in others, so he's an easy target for malicious people to take advantage of. After communicating with my dad for a bit, his late mother, my grandmother who passed away a year earlier, came into the dream with desperation and urgency. I didn't want to speak with her, but she insisted I had to listen because she had things to say to the family. I looked at my dad sadly, and he communicated that he could not stay and could not communicate with me anymore because she was there. Apparently she was stronger than him. He was gone. Despite her insistence and desperation, I didn't listen to my grandmother except to learn that she was trapped in a place and needed to move on. I did not try to help or listen further as my dad was gone. I woke up. I had an intense feeling that this was not a dream. And now 5 years later, I remember the dream vividly, and the feeling that this was a real communication with my dad and, unfortunately, my grandmother. I believe my dad wanted to let me know he was okay, but I also got the feeling that he was very new in the place where he was and not yet strong enough to truly hold his own there. I believe he had an opportunity to speak with me and took it. I've had dreams of him in the last few years, but never one like that. I love and miss my dad every day.
So, normally I work night shifts. Before I leave my house, I make sure to turn off every light except the living room and kitchen lights. For the past few months, I've been getting home around 11 p.m. For the first week or so, I would go to my room and my light would be on. I know for a fact I had turned it off. I'm one of those people who check something 6 times before they leave. As soon as that started to happen regularly on my days off, I could be upstairs and hear loud banging coming from downstairs, where my room is. I've just ignored it and blamed it on loud pipes. To add to this, my television has been turning on when I leave too. I've had my maintenance man come and check on wiring and everything, and nothing is wrong. Well, last night was the last straw. I can't stand being in this house by myself. So, I had a dream. It was pretty terrifying. It starts out, me and a guy go to a cabin with a few friends. Note, I can't see anyone's face. Everything is cool until we watch some type of movie I couldn't tell what it was. The movie is over, so we go to bed. As I start to fall asleep, I hear scratching coming from the walls. I blew it off, but the next night it moves closer to under the bed. In the morning, the guy I'm with starts to act weird, like talking about ancient rituals and sacrifices. It gets weirder as the night goes on. He starts talking about one of his friends, but no one was there. We go to bed that night and the scratching starts again, getting even closer, almost right under me. Around 12 o'clock, he gets out of bed, but I go back to sleep. In the morning, I wake up to an empty bed. I walk downstairs and he is sitting in the middle of the living room just staring at the wall. I see nothing but black for a minute. And then I find myself in a room with him again, but this time we aren't alone. There's something in the corner he was talking to. As I back up to leave the room, the thing stands up out of the corner and points at me. The dim light hits its face, and I could see that it was something white, but around the eyes and mouth, it looked like when you wear eyeliner and it smears when you cry. The man stands up and turns around, covered in blood. I want to scream, but it feels like something is in my mouth. He starts to run towards me, then everything goes black again, and I wake up. Growing up, I was always taught your dreams always mean something. I need help.
This is the most terrifying and vivid dream I've ever experienced, and was a few years ago. I was in my sister's hometown because she was in the hospital, so her room as well as her roommate's room was empty. My parents stayed in her room while I stayed in the roommate's. We'd been there for a few days and I had no previous issues up until then. I was laying on her bed watching TV, on the phone with my boyfriend, and overall drifting off since it was late. I could faintly hear him snoring on the other end of the phone, and I too, myself, felt like I was drifting. I vividly remember what apparently was a dream that felt very real. I was in an unknown house getting out of the bathtub. I walked past the hallway and to the room to sit and watch TV. Everything was normal for a few minutes, when out of the corner of my eye I saw movement. I turned, seeing the long hallway of this unfamiliar house. The light above it was flickering like it would in a typical scary movie. I ignored it and looked back to the show I was watching, but again saw something with my peripherals. I turned quicker this time, thinking I'd be able to catch whatever it was before it disappeared again, and I saw a tall dark figure, but it wasn't a person. I was immediately filled with fear and dread. I was frozen for what seemed like hours. The light began flickering in longer bursts. It would shut off completely, then light back on for a brief second. And every time it did this, the thing would move closer to me. The light would illuminate it closer than the previous time, and I jumped off the couch and tried opening the door to escape, but no matter how hard I tried, the door just wouldn't open. I was scratching and clawing to no avail. I could sense this thing behind me. I knew it was there, but I was too afraid to turn and see it face to face. I was completely filled with fear. I felt something hot on the back of my neck and heard a mumbling, though I couldn't make out what was being said. I collapsed to my knees, still clawing at the door, this thing looming over me even if I didn't see it. I knew it and felt it. Suddenly my eyes opened and I was back in my sister's townhouse, but unable to move. I was awake again, but in what I can only describe as sleep paralysis. Movement drew my eyes to the right side of the bed and I could see curtains moving. My mind tried rationalizing it. The fan? No, it was off. Was it the window? No, I never opened it. Again I sensed movement from the curtains. Something was pushing through it, getting closer to me. I could see the outline of a very tall person like the figure in my dream. My brain was screaming for me to get up and run, but my body wasn't cooperating. The curtain pulled off this thing and I was face to face with it. I wanted to shut my eyes, look away, anything to not see it, but I couldn't even shut my eyes. It was in the shape of a man. As I said previously, it was very tall and skinny, and it was inky black. The blackest black you can imagine. It had no features, no clothes, nothing. It had no eyes, but I felt like it was staring at me. I was in full panic mode at this point. I saw a flicker of color, and suddenly I realized I was staring into a pair of glowing red eyes. We held contact for what seemed like hours, when I felt movement in my body again. I snapped out of it, jumped out of the bed and ran down the hall to my sister's room where my parents were asleep. I knocked frantically on their door, calling for my mum. The knocking turned to pounding, and my call turned to yelling for my parents to let me in. I never turned back towards the room. I was too afraid to see those eyes peering through the doorway or seeing it stalking me. They opened the door, confused at the sight of their 22-year-old daughter crying and screaming in the middle of the night. They questioned me, but I made up a lie, as I knew they'd think I was having a nightmare or I was just exaggerating. I told them that I thought someone was trying to break in through the window, but that didn't make sense either since we were on a second story, but I stuck to it. My dad went to check and of course found nothing. Needless to say, I opted to sleep in the floor of their room with my parents for the rest of our stay. I don't know what it was and I can't explain it, but it was definitely a traumatizing experience that I still struggle with. Did I get a visit from a shadow person, ghost, demon? Or was it just all a dream?
A couple years back, I used to get sleep paralysis pretty often, but never saw a demon or anything crazy. I'd have some weird dreams too, but nothing extraordinary worth talking about, aside from maybe one string of unusual dreams. Fast forward to this week. A couple nights back, I had a dream I was having sleep paralysis, and I was watching my body struggle to move from the side of my bed. I woke up after that and went about my day. Just now, I had a dream I was in my childhood home. I was in my sister's old room. I'm not sure if I was visiting or living at home, but I was working on a project in a very movie-esque fashion. My mom has popped in the room and asked if I wanted anything, then said she was heading off to bed, which was weird because there was a lot of natural light, so I'm assuming it was midday. Anyway, I continued working, took a break, and went to head back to the room after a snack, and it was dark now. Suddenly, I saw another very overused movie cliché, where I had just seen a dim flash in front of me and could vaguely make the outline of a person. I was on the phone with someone and went to turn the lights on when I realized they weren't working. At that moment, I started to lose control of my body and was slowly fighting my way to the floor. I was trying to get out of the room to get help, but couldn't. After being on the floor for a second, I felt a tug. I started sliding toward the bed on the other side of the room. I tried to reach, kick, yell, anything, but I couldn't do anything more than look around and make a psh sound. I can't see what's under the bed since there was a bed skirt in the way, but I knew it was the flash of what I had seen earlier. I'm under the bed face to face with this thing, and then nothing. I wake up to find myself in the bed where I'm currently living, which is across the country. Panicking, I begin reciting the Lord's Prayer. I haven't said this prayer or anything in years. The church was never a big part of my life. I glance at the wall, and when I look back, this female demon is stiff as a board, floating above me. Gray skin, muddy clothes, missing skin and flesh, gazing with pure white eyes that are level with mine. I see a butcher's knife out of the corner of my left eye and watch as it starts to come down, about to pierce my chest in between my collarbones. At the last second, it stops. I looked back, and my left hand had found a way to grab the forearm of this demon. But I didn't feel my arm moving. I didn't feel the force of resisting the momentum from the intended stab. I could just feel this slight burning pain right on the inside of my right collarbone. It grew until I suddenly woke up, but I didn't look at my chest. I didn't touch my chest. I didn't move. Not because I was paralyzed. I just tried to make sense of this dream, and I didn't dare move. Now I'm writing this.
To start the story off, for context, I absolutely despise bugs of all kind. Oh, of course, I loved them as a child, but over the years, from being bitten by every local bug imaginable, I began to despise them. Since I was raised in the South, I had fallen victim to fire ants, and I seemed to give off a certain scent that attracts every mosquito and flea from miles around. But what did I hate the most? Roaches. Such disgusting creatures, the way they look, the way they move. Safe to say I had an intense phobia of them. I inherited a house from my dead grandmother in my late teens, and since it had been abandoned for about a year. That's right, you guessed it. It had become infested with large water bugs. Sleeping in the house was a nightmare, since occasionally the bugs found their way onto my bed. I could even hear them crawling in the walls at night. To cut a long story short, I went to extreme measures to eliminate them from my new home, and the war lasted a few years at least. One night after spraying and fighting with these pests, I retired for the night, thoroughly creeped out. That night I went to bed and had one of the most vivid and disturbing nightmares of my entire life. I remember that me and my family were traveling, and we couldn't find a motel. This was a common occurrence with my family anyway, and they usually would wait until late at night only to find run-down cheap motels. After arguing what to do, we came across an abandoned-looking building, and my family decided that this was where we were going to stay. I guess because it was free? I voiced my complaints, but their decision was adamant. As we walked inside, it ended up being my old apartment building from childhood. Except the entire place was in ruins, as if hundreds of years had passed and the building was barely left standing. Deep cracks could be seen all over the walls, as well as large holes in the flooring. Dirt was everywhere, and both small patches of grass and vines were beginning to invade the building through these holes. I remember wondering just what in the hell happened to this place, since it did carry sentimental value after all. An overall feeling of depression and dread could be felt in every room as I explored, like some sort of curse had taken over these walls. When I went into what was my old bedroom, I saw the haunting image of my original bed as a child still there, except it was just as dirty as the rest of the apartment. The rest of the apartment is empty, but what is my bed still doing here, I wondered. I did my best to shake the dust from the sheets since we were apparently stuck sleeping here. I complained a few more times, but my father shouted and insisted that I lay down and close my eyes, so I did. I don't remember any form of electricity being in the apartment, but suddenly everything went dark. Only a dim glow could be seen emanating from moonlight shining through the holes and cracks in the walls. Suddenly, small bugs could be felt crawling on me. I wasn't surprised by this at all considering the environment, so I just shook them off and tried to ignore it. This kept happening, and eventually, I had had enough. I jumped out of bed only to discover a far worse situation that I can imagine. Bugs everywhere. Green caterpillars all over the floor, spiders, and of course roaches everywhere too. I lost my mind. I ran into the other room with my parents, screaming that I wanted to leave now. At first they ignored me, but as these large bugs that I had never seen before began emerging from the cracks, emitted a screeching sound, they finally jumped up and decided it was time to leave as well. We packed our things as fast as we could, but when we went to the exit, a large group of screaming roaches approached our way. We weren't able to get through them. They moved with lightning speed as they ran all over the room, in and out of the cracks. One of the strange bugs I couldn't identify earlier bit me, and I let out a scream as I stomped on it, turning it into a pile of goo. Several more approached us, and all I can say is that they appeared like praying mantises, but different. We had no other choice but to fight. We went around stomping on whatever got close to us, while fighting off some of the flying bugs with our hands, and still occasionally getting bitten in the process. A swarm of flying bugs surrounded my face, and I fell backwards while trying to fight them off. That was when I saw what I can truly say was the most horrifying image I'd ever seen. I sat up and saw a large, roundish centipede-like creature emerging from a large hole. The creature was red, and not nearly as long as any normal centipede, but still had many legs. The creature crawled onto a large rock, and as its backside was visible, I saw the human face of an old man on its back. The human face was actually part of the creature, centered with dozens of legs attached to the side of its face. The face looked right at me, and its expression was contorted in pain as it made a light screeching sound, the same sound that someone makes when they're being choked, as if it had been human at one point and was left doomed to spend the rest of its life and existence in agony on this creature's back. Thankfully, I immediately woke up after this, but felt very disturbed. I couldn't get the image out of my mind for weeks. And since I'm an artist, I feel the need to paint that image onto canvases. I think it's a way of me confronting my fear. Even as I painted this, I felt the image come into place. A true déjà vu feeling. The picture hangs on my bedroom, and as time passed, I am no longer afraid of it. It has become my favorite of all my art creations, and the one I am most proud of. Something that truly came out of my head, and mine alone.
My grandmother died of old age and had a really bad alcohol problem, along with lung problems due to smoking. I've had multiple dreams of my grandmother who passed away this year, February 24th, 2020. The only thing that is different is, twice when I dreamed about her, she said the same exact words to me when I saw her, in two of my dreams. The first time I dreamt about her, I was sitting in her house on her couch, and I was surprised to see her come out of her bedroom alive. And I said to her, "Grandma Jean, I thought you were supposed to be dead." She replied back to me and said, "Well, I have to be put to rest." So I figured it was just a dream of her visiting me. But today, I just woke up and had another dream about her. It was about me and my mom going past her old house, and we saw her dogs in the window. She had two pit bulls who would always look out the window from her bedroom on her bed. And she came out from the back door. Her arms were gangrene, but her face was normal, and she said to me, "I have to be put to rest." And then she came up to me and gave me a big hug and kissed me on the cheek, and her arms went back to a normal flesh color. I don't know what it means when she keeps saying I have to be put to rest. Her family is very shady, and I think there was some foul play in her death, and the police won't get involved, obviously. Just to let you know, my grandmother was my adopted grandmother, as in I met this wonderful lady from church. She treated me like her own biological granddaughter, and I've known her for 20 years. She did not have a funeral mass, a proper burial, or any type of memorial service. My grandmother was very religious and loved Jesus, and I want her to be put to rest. Does anyone know what this means? This is the second time she told me that she needs to be put to rest.
When I was a little kid, about 6, I started having this recurring nightmare that follows me still to this day. I'm 17 now for reference. The nightmare took place in a dark castle, the type that you'd see in a horror movie and know instantly it was haunted. I was walking down a corridor of the castle with my mum and sister when we were passing a painting of a tea party. One of the people in the painting, a tall, pale man dressed in all black, stood up and turned to us, beckoning for my mother to follow him. My sister and I tried to stop her, tried to hold her back, but she didn't even seem to notice us. My mother entered the painting and walked further into it, arm in arm with the strange man. My sister and I decided that we needed to find her, but as we searched through the castle, we got separated. I don't know how long I was looking, but I do know that I found my mum, as well as the most traumatizing part of this dream. I stumbled onto the castle's throne room, and it was the most disturbing thing I'd ever seen. The whole room was bathed in red, fiery light that was emanating from a huge fireplace behind the throne that a man from the painting was sitting on, as well as from a gaping hole in the wall that was closing and opening in intervals. There was a huge crowd of people in the throne room. I knew that if they saw me, they would hurt me. So I crept through the shadows on the edge of the throne room until I was just under the hole in the wall. I could hear bits and pieces of conversation from the people gathered around, but nothing made sense. The worst part is that going into the hole in the wall was a conveyor belt style operation, with large metal hooks going down from it, like in a meat processing plant. While that might not be terribly scary, the really messed up part was that hanging from these hooks were all of my loved ones, and they were all alive. To make matters worse, I knew that my family and friends were being drained of their blood and then burnt in that hole. My best friend at the time was just about to go into the fiery hole when he looked directly down at me and gasped, "You caused this," with a look of betrayal and accusation. I was so shocked I couldn't move. As he was being drawn into the hole, I overheard a group of older women laughing and talking about what a shame it was they couldn't get the full set before one of them caught sight of me and grabbed me. It was at that moment I awoke.
Let me just start by saying I'm 99% sure that it was all in my head. And I thought it was amusing until I told my sister, and she freaked the hell out and told me to never do it again. I guess it might fit here. Anyway, I've been experimenting with lucid dreaming for some years, and I'm able to control my dream on a semi-regular basis. But recently, I've been experimenting with sleeping paralysis, as the idea fascinated me since I discovered it. I've long gotten over the initial hallucinations, black figures and such. Google it. The shit looks real AF. And am now, kind of, able to induce the paralysis at will. Now for what I think of as the creepy part. When under sleeping paralysis, my body, as I see it, isn't moving, but it feels like it does. I am, for example, able to feel my hand touch my face, even if I see it lying on my stomach. So extending this, I tried leaning up, still seemingly not moving my body. It was hard. Felt like moving through thick water. But after some struggling, it felt like I was sitting by the bedside. This meant that I felt myself sitting and my sight had moved position. But looking to my right, I could still see my legs on the bed lying down. Worse yet, trying to look left, I was unable to look at my own face, like something was stopping my eyes from turning that far. Now to me, this was just a dream, and I was simply fascinated, and decided, why not stand up? And so I did, and I decided to walk to my window, still looking down, not seeing my feet under me. Then turning back to my room, I was able to see my body up to my neck, but I was unable to look at my face. Still not freaked out, as I've seen far worse things in my dreams, I decided to try and move things in my room, and walked over to my clothes lying on the ground. This is where things get a bit fuzzy, because I seemingly forgot that I was dreaming, and started picking up my clothes and putting them on. However, I still couldn't see my body, and the clothes I picked up stayed in place, even though I could feel myself picking them up. After getting dressed, or feeling such, I decided to head to the kitchen for some breakfast. It was a Saturday morning I was doing this, and it was as I was heading to the door, I looked back into the room and saw my body on the bed. That's when I kind of freaked out, because I had forgotten all about my experiment until I saw my body again. Still not being able to look at my own face, I decided enough was probably enough for now, and walked back to my bedside, leaned my invisible head as close to my visible head as possible, looked at my lying body as if I was lying there myself, and closed my eyes. When I opened them again, I was lying in bed again and could move. So yeah, I swear that everything I've written here is what I've experienced, and is not a creepypasta or no sleep, as if I write well enough for that.
When I was 16, my best friend and next-door neighbor ended her life on January 21st, 2006. Every night after that, I would either dream of her entirely, or she would intrude in my other dreams. I remember a dream about a dance recital once where everyone was dancing. She was in the back dancing with a rope around her neck. The dream wasn't about her, but she was there nonetheless. Very unpleasant stuff. It made my grief so much harder to get through. However, it was pretty clear those dreams were just that, dreams. I wasn't frightened, nor was I in any way denying that it was my obvious subconscious thoughts, that I dreamed her every single night. On December 31st, 2006, I went to bed. I remember that I dreamed that night that my friend and I were in a field of wildflowers. There was so much sunlight that everything was white, and we were holding hands and she was smiling. We laid down next to each other and I was looking at her. We were silent for a while, and very serenely I asked her, "Were you in pain?" The sound of the field was replaced by this progressive loud ringing until it was so loud my teeth hurt. She answered silently. I watched her face go from smiling to clenching her teeth, turning red, and her face changing until she looked like she was in so much pain. She grasped my hand in hers so hard her fingernails dug into it, and I woke up a few minutes later, turned on the light to see if there was a mark, and of course there wasn't. But that dream felt incredibly different than the others I'd ever had. So vivid, so raw. Point is, I never dreamed of her again after that. I got over her death and put my grief to rest. I'm 27 now, and it's been 12 years.
The following true story happened to me when I was a sophomore in high school, during the fall of 1991. It began with a dark dream. I don't recall everything from the dream, but I remember an image of a bridge and that of a baseball field. There was also fire, and I woke up with a bad feeling. Several days later, I was laying in bed when a date popped into my head, almost as if somebody said it. It felt connected to the dream, and I concluded that something bad would happen around this date. Somehow, I knew it would be a murder, and I felt so sure of it, I vividly recall looking through the classified section of the local newspaper to see how one would take out an ad as a way to document my premonition. Now, to give some context on how rare this event would be, I grew up in an upper-middle-class suburb with a low crime rate, and prior to this, there had not been a murder in a decade or so. The date in late October came and went, and I forgot about the whole thing. But a couple weeks later, November 7th, I went home because of a half day at school. My mother worked from home as a reporter for the big city newspaper, and she was gone when I arrived, which was unusual. When she got back, she told me there was a murder in town and they called on me to cover it. She explained where it was, and to my amazement, the house was almost exactly equidistant from a baseball field and a bridge, just as in the dream. I was a couple of weeks off in my prediction, but like I said before, such events were so rare there that to predict a murder, let alone the general location within a couple of weeks, is definitely something. I didn't and still don't know what to make of it. Could be coincidence. I felt so sure it was coming. That's another odd aspect of the story.
When my son was about 6 months old, I had a dream that I was at my grandparents' house with him. My grandfather was holding my son and crying while I spoke with my grandmother. I told her that I wished her and my grandfather were still alive to see my son, and she said, "Don't worry, we see him." I didn't think anything else until 5 years later, I was talking to my sister and I mentioned that I'd had a dream about my grandparents. She said, "Was Papa Joe," that's what we called our grandfather, "holding your son while he rocked in his chair? And did Grandma tell you they were watching you?" "Yes," I said. "How did you know that?" I had the same dream when my son was 6 months old. And more recently, my son, he was 20 at the time, was driving home from work late one night. As he drove, he said he very clearly heard my mother, who had been dead for 2 years, say, "Jonathan, stop the car." Out of reflex he did, and as soon as he stopped, 3 deer ran out in front of him. Had he not stopped the car, he'd have hit them.
My parents have these longtime friends, and they didn't want to have a child. So they asked me to go to a shelter to pick out a dog about 7 or 8 years ago, before this incident. I found the perfect dog, named Snoopy, and Snoopy and I became best friends, especially because I wasn't allowed to have pets. And this dog became their only child. Flash forward those 7 years. I'm in college, ridiculously busy, and haven't heard from these family friends nor seen Snoopy in about 3 years, and I haven't thought about them in a long time. I'm in the dorms and I had this dream that Snoopy and I were playing in a field. I was throwing a frisbee while running and laughing like we did years ago when he was a pup and I was little. This dream felt so real and I woke up feeling so good. So I called my dad and asked him to tell our family friends I missed them and had a dream about Snoopy, which he thought was a weird request, but he texted them anyway. I'm going about my day in college and I get a call from my dad saying that his friend called him back and I need to go visit Snoopy right now. Turns out, the night before, they found out he had cancer everywhere and needed to be put down ASAP and didn't want our family to see him in this state and was going to tell us after. I drove to their house bawling my eyes out. Totally not safe. Whoops. My family was already there and he was laying on his bed not moving. He must have smelled me or heard my voice because he got up and tried to hop up and lick my face. Everyone was so shocked he could move. He settled back into his bed, and I sobbed my goodbyes and told him how much I loved him and appreciated him coming to tell me in my dreams that it was his time to go.
My grandmother had passed away about a week prior, and I was sleeping in bed when I suddenly woke up. My grandma was standing at the door. I knew it couldn't be because she was obviously deceased. I didn't move, and she slowly began to glide towards me. She reached down, touched my feet, and said, "Everything's gonna be okay, mijo." It was strangely calm, and she just glided back. Knowing this was impossible, I assumed that it was a dream, so in an attempt to check reality, I reached over and unplugged my alarm clock, plugged it back in, and went back to sleep. The next morning, my mum woke me up, and when I checked the time, it was flashing 3:17. It was actually 7:30. I was strangely okay with the anomaly, and accepted the fact that my dead grandma stopped in to say, "What's up?"
On multiple occasions in my life, I have had dreams that have 100% accurately predicted my future. Most were small things. I once had a dream when I was in high school that exams were postponed a day because someone kept pulling the fire alarm. Next week during exams, someone pulled the fire alarm a half dozen times and the exams had to be pushed back. I remember having a dream about going to someone's house I had never met with my mom. In the dream, I was shy and wouldn't come past the entranceway. In the dream, they said, "You can come in, we don't bite." Sure enough, a few days later, my mom goes to visit some friends and brings me. The same people from my dream, same entranceway, same words. Exactly. I even brought it up later to my mom and she laughed it off. Much later in life, though, I had a dream that was much more meaningful, and I haven't had one of that weight since. But when I was 12, I had a dream that I was standing outside my granddad's house. It was winter and he was holding a big suitcase. I asked him where he was going, and he said, "I have to take a trip, little buddy." I asked if I could come, and he said, "No, it's a long trip, but you'll see me again eventually." Then he put the suitcase in the back of his car and drove off. The next day, my dad called me and told me that my granddad had serious complications during what was supposed to be a minor medical procedure and wouldn't last until the next day. That same night he passed. Maybe all this stuff is a coincidence, maybe not. I'm not a believer in religion or the supernatural, but whether you believe it or not, this did happen. Now, every time I have a bad dream with someone I know or love in it, I always check on them after.
I once woke up at night and there was this figure standing next to my bed. It looked like a small boy, maybe 5 years old, wearing one of those old-timey sailor suits that children used to get dressed up in the late 19th to early 20th century. The boy was semi-transparent and asked for help. If you think it sounded creepy so far, it got worse. I suddenly saw myself from another angle, with my eyes open, staring at the boy ghost, and my body rose up, and I said in a deep, unnatural voice, "Your soul is mine." And my mouth opened, wider than a human mouth should, more like a snake's mouth, and I swallowed the ghost. Then I woke up, thinking, wow, that was a rather creepy dream. Strangely enough, my stomach felt full, just as if I had eaten a good meal mere minutes before. It was 5 a.m. though, and I probably hadn't eaten since 1 a.m. like my post-midnight snack. That was a few years ago. Never experienced anything like it again. I do have to say I rarely have traditional nightmares. Was something chasing me? Usually I'm the ones chasing something.
I used to have these dreams when I was a child. I chose to write it dreams because they were nothing like a dream, nightmare, sleepwalking, or even sleep paralysis. I have had all of those. It's impossible to imagine this experience without experiencing it oneself. There is literally no equivalent that I can compare it to, but I want to share it anyways, since it's something that was burned into my memory and changed the way I view the world. I was 6 to 10 years old when I had these dreams. I always had a high fever when they occurred, and I always saw the exact same things happening in the exact same order every time. It would start off with me getting the Alice in Wonderland syndrome. Everything started feeling small, plastic, virtual, and unreal. The physical environment suddenly made me feel uneasy and uncomfortable. My thought processes became extremely linear. After this stage, white circles appeared in empty space. These white circles used to float along an invisible line in empty space. After reaching the end of the lines, the circles faded and started over a few times. I almost developed a fear for white circles in waking life due to this. I always felt like traveling through a tunnel or spinning. That was like the entrance to the breakthrough. There was no time, up or down, and my sense of self seemed to have dissolved. I saw a lot of bright colors at the end of the tunnel. The visuals I saw were hyper-realistic. It had more depth than the eye can see in waking life. I remember that I was suddenly in a bright orange room that was both finite and infinite simultaneously. The room was being filled with platonic solids, which were moving agonizingly slow. The platonic solids seemed to be made of vibrating energy. Some of the platonic solids were super tiny. Some were huge. The size of the room kept growing exponentially to the amounts/sizes of the platonic solids, so the room was never too big nor too small for them. The platonic solids gravitated towards an invisible line. I felt a completely unbearable feeling of dread during this. Something about the slowness, timelessness, and the entire experience was horrible. I always woke up after this. I felt totally drained of all energy. I puked, cried, and refused to sleep alone afterwards. I had goosebumps and felt extremely nauseous several hours afterwards. There is nothing in everyday life you can compare this to. All nightmares, sleep paralysis, sleepwalking, you name it, are like child's play in comparison to this. I had no idea what platonic solids were at that age. I used to call them weird 3D shapes before I knew about platonic solids. These experiences are actually what got me interested in geometry and patterns. Some people suggest that it might have been night terror, but that is characterized by waking up feeling dread, but not remembering anything. And I remember very clearly all the visuals and all. Others suggest it may have been a bad DMT trip. The pineal gland produces DMT, which is theorized to be released during the extreme conditions, such as a near-death experience. Why not during a high fever, too? Maybe the brain prepared to die, or it overheated.
Several months ago, my wife and I went to bed as we normally do. I have untreated sleep apnea, which means that I never really get a good night's sleep and I'm always tired. I can lie down and be asleep in the middle of a sentence. As I was in that extremely short period of not awake but not really asleep, I could feel myself sinking deeper into sleep. As I approached true sleep, I had a brief impression of being in another location, with a nurse nearby saying, "Doctor, he's starting to wake up." I knew somehow that I had been in a coma and that I was starting to get out of it. Then I started flipping back into the coma there while waking up here and hearing the nurse say, "Never mind, false alarm, he's still in a coma." It was just like an old-fashioned balance scale, as on one side it rose and the other fell. It happened again a second time, but I'm not sure if it was that night or the next. I had a bad dissociative episode recently and the memory of this fed into it. After all, if everything here is a coma dream, I may have loved ones there waiting for me to wake up.
When I was like 7, I had one of the weirdest dreams ever. So, I don't know why, but apparently I was like 15 years old in the dream, and I was having coffee with some relatives. That's when someone in the dream casually mentions my age, and one of them tells me, "Go get Yasmina, she's come back from the dead." The weird thing is that Yasmina was an aunt of mine, who had actually died several years before I was born, so the news to my 15-year-old dreamy self was amazing. The relative gave me her address, and I went there walking. Distances and the likes were very skewed in my dream. I arrived at an all-white housing complex that gave me the creeps because it was empty and something about it was just unnerving. I located the house and saw that it had one of those things that produce sound when the air blows. And the wind was blowing, but the thing didn't produce a single sound. I knock on the door several times and I hear a distant, "Come in," so I go into the house. The first thing I notice is a weird-looking mirror placed on the wall that is right in front of the entrance door. As I go near it, I realize that I'm too short for the mirror to reflect my image, so I start jumping. I somehow forget that I am not there to check on a weird mirror, and I see that it is ovalish, silver, and has some flowers or something as an ornament. Later on, I realize that the surface of the mirror is moving instead of actually showing my image when jumping, like weird circles going on. I get goosebumps, so I stop what I'm doing. I turn around and see a lady watching me with a smirk, and next thing I know, she's introducing herself as Yasmina and telling me how lovely I look and how she already knows that I'm turning 16 in a couple of weeks because my grandma told her. Then, all hell breaks loose. While we were both smiling and giggling, someone on the upper floor starts screaming, cursing, and saying offensive things to my aunt. I hear some thumps, and my aunt's face is pale and in shock. She grabs me by the arm and she starts running and running and running until I feel like I'm flying. When we stop, I notice that we are still in the all-white housing complex, even though it seems like we should be somewhere else by now. She turns to me, looks me in the eye and says, "Tell everyone that I'm all right and that I met you. Another day then. You'll be just like this someday." The next thing I remember, I woke up and I felt extremely sad. But not the normal kind of sadness, more like nostalgic and empty. I go to my mom and tell her about the dream, and she goes pale when I mention the mirror. She was being pretty skeptical. So I described it to her and she tells me that Yasmina had a mirror that covered my description, but that it had somehow got lost after her death. She asks me to describe how Yasmina looks, and now she freaks out because she says that that is how Yasmina looked like, but I had never seen a picture of her, as far as she can tell from my description. And no, her looks weren't standard, nor similar to my mom's. So she goes around some boxes and she hands me a photo, and I just say, "That's Yasmina." But the one I saw had dark circles under her eyes, as if she hadn't slept much. I tell her about someone yelling and my mom remains in silence, not daring to speak. Not long after, I overheard her telling another aunt my dream. About the mirror, Yasmina's looks and the yelling and cursing, to which my aunt just said, "I can't believe it. Even in a kid's dream, Yasmina was being yelled at by someone. But could it be Xavier? No. I mean, that's not possible. This is very weird."
I rarely have nightmares, and while this one didn't necessarily scare me, it did make me feel disturbed. It all happened like it was a movie. I wasn't in it, more so watching it occur. It was a forest at dusk. A small boy held a rifle trained at a deer in the distance, his dad by his side, quietly encouraging his son, and the boy's uncle a few yards back. The kid takes the shot, the deer falls, and the boy smiles up to his dad as they start walking towards the body. As they approach the deer just a few feet from it now, they hear a branch snap and they freeze in their steps. From behind the trees, cloaked figures surround them. The dad steps in front of his son, and one steps towards them. The dad asks, "What's going on here?" And the cloaked man responds, "This deer is ours. Get out of here now." The dad, enraged, yells they shot it, and it's rightfully theirs, and the uncle finally approaches the group looking confused and apprehensive. The cloaked man made a slight wave with his hand, and from behind all the trees, a cracked in the head with the butt of the cloaked figure's rifle. Next scene, I see the cloaked figures are now in a small kitchen with their robes off, in regular clothes like blue jeans and a t-shirt. They're smoking and drinking, and they stare at something on the ground and start to laugh hysterically. Slowly crawling into view is the uncle, his legs and arms freshly amputated, and dried blood stains on the bandages around the stumps, his face black and blue, and his nose horribly broken. One of the men take a drag of his cigarette and kicks the crawling man in the gut. The uncle drops to the floor with the wind knocked out of him. The men roared with laughter. Down the hall, a door opens and a man steps out adjusting his belt, and you can hear the boy sobbing. The uncle gets up again on all fours and starts to crawl to the room with the boy in it. Once the man gets up from leaning on the counter and chuckles, "Oh no you don't," the men start to laugh as he grabs the uncle by his ripped pant leg, making his hand slip from underneath him and bust his chin on the floor, dragging him to a different room. The remaining men in the kitchen open the pantry. The dad has all his limbs removed, much like the uncle, just above the elbow and knees, his face swollen, almost unrecognizable. They laugh as they see him inch towards the exit, pain twisting on his face as he moved. One man grabs him by the collar of his shirt and throws him across the floor to where a man is standing with a bat. The guy with the bat asks the men around him if they're ready, and they all cheer enthusiastically. The man raised the bat and smashes it onto the dad. The dad looks around confused, unaware of what's happening to him, body shaking and the men laughing. The man with the bat throws it aside, opens a dishwasher and throws him in, saying, "Let's get you cleaned up now." At that point I woke up. I sat up in bed and just thought, what the hell did I dream up? I felt overwhelming despair for the family. It was the first time I'd ever had such a violent dream, and I wondered if my brain was really that messed up. After that, I decided to lay off the scary stories for a while.
I have always been interested in paranormal encounters, but still held a decent amount of skepticism towards it. Until about 4 years ago now, I had a dream that I cannot get out of my head. I tried to dismiss it, or even rationalize it, but that has never worked. I was living in a small town with my only neighbor being a rather rotund woman in her late 60s. A side note that I will get back to later. She was obsessed with these little porcelain masks that hung all over her house. My mother often acted as a caretaker for her, as it was difficult for the woman to do many things on her own. She was prone to falls and often needed help getting back on her feet. Most of the time, an emergency response team would come to help her. One day, while my cousins and I were loading some equipment into our garage, we heard her yelling for help. She had fallen trying to get up the stairs into her house. The three of us laboriously returned her to the couch in her living room and had some laughs about the situation, and all was well. I thought. That night, I dreamt what I can only describe as an out-of-body experience. It was as if I was standing in my neighbor's bedroom at the foot of her bed. She was not breathing, and as I approached her, the sound of a clock had begun to grow louder and louder. As I looked around to find the timepiece responsible, I saw the usually hollow eyes of the masks pointing all in the same direction. All eyes were on the calendar hung by her bedroom door. Upon closer inspection, a date had been circled, 3 days after the fall. I awoke in a cold sweat, wondering what in the hell the dream was about. Why was this the first dream in months I was able to recall after waking? I lie in bed, thinking about this for what felt like an eternity, until I finally dozed off again, only to return to a still image of the calendar. The next day, I was still very uneasy. I tried my best to just brush it off, but the part about this whole ordeal that bothers and baffles me more than any of it is that I told my mother about it. Not the fact that I told her, but how I told her. I do not remember informing her at all. In fact, I felt I was actively avoiding it, so the only way to quote myself is secondhand. According to her, I told her while we were outside later that morning. I just walked up and blankly said, "I'm afraid she only has 3 days left," and went back to what I was doing. Of course, this ominous message was not taken seriously until the clock ticked down and the 3 days had passed. On the morning of the 3rd day since my bizarre dream, we awoke to a phone call from our neighbor's sister, informing my mother that she had passed in her sleep. I would love to say this was a one-off thing, but I have a history of much smaller and not so dark premonitions that have only become more confusing since this.
I've only had sleep paralysis once in my life, and it was terrifying. I had woken from a deep sleep and was completely aware of everything. I could feel the blanket laying on me and the exact position I was laying in. What scared me was the presence I felt hanging over me at the foot of my bed. It was heavy and dark. I was panicking and trying my hardest to move. I kept thinking, "I need to move," over and over, and I passed out. I didn't immediately remember what happened in the morning. The memory came back later that day, and I discussed it with some of my work friends, and their opinions ranged from normal to paranormal. I was little on the fence to which it was, but I was scared to sleep for a while. A few weeks later, I was drifting off to sleep when I felt the presence again. This time it was beside my bed. I was facing away from it and went stiff, hoping it would go away. It took me a few minutes to get the courage to flip around. When I did, I caught a very clear view of it before it vanished. It was a dark shape that almost resembled a human, but wasn't solid enough in shape. I didn't sleep well the rest of the night. I told my best friend about it. That's when I learnt what it was. Shades feed off your energy. They're drawn to negative emotions like stress and anxiety, which mine were very high at the time. She's a witch and brought me a bottle that contained Himalayan sea salt, rose petal, and a few other things. I only saw it once after that. I was trying to sleep but still very awake. I opened my eyes and saw it, as clear as the other time before it vanished again. I hadn't felt its presence, and I believe it was my friend's concoction that kept it away. It's been about a year since that happened, and I think it actually got rid of it.
So I lived in the same house from when I was born to when I was about 13 or so. But when I was 5 or 6, I went from having a daybed in the corner of my room to a larger, very tall. Like, I used to lay under it on my stomach and read, that's how tall it was. Bed that I had to climb into. Obviously, like most kids I knew, that space under my bed, especially because it was so big, freaked me out. But that wasn't the weird, unexplainable thing. The new position of my bed meant that I could see a certain section of the wall in the hallway right outside my door. The hallway was kind of an L shape, with the short end where my door was, and the long end going down the other side of my bedroom wall down to where my parents' bedroom was. We didn't have any streetlights in our neighborhood, but the bathroom was on the long side of the L, and there was a nightlight in it. So if someone was coming up the hallway, once they passed the bathroom, they'd cast a faint shadow on the section of wall I could see from the bed. I became used to this pretty quick, because whenever I'd wake up from a bad dream, I had a lot of them when I was little. I'd be too scared to put my feet down next to the big gap under my bed, so I'd shout for my mom until she came to check on me. Within a couple of months, I could tell immediately if the shadow was her or my dad, and it was a very comforting sight. So probably 9 months or a year after I got this new bed, I woke up from a really bad dream one night, and I looked out my bedroom door and saw what I assumed was my mom's shadow on the wall, already coming to check on me. Cue a flood of relief, and I called out, quietly, because I thought she was about to turn the corner. "Mommy, I had a bad dream again." Except the shadow didn't move closer or further away, and no one came around the corner. For some reason, I wasn't scared yet, and was more concerned than anything. And because Mom was right there, clearly it was safe to get out of bed because the monsters wouldn't grab me if she was standing there. So I hopped out of bed and padded into the hallway, and I could see the shadow this whole time. And I turned the corner, and there was no one there. I turned back to the wall, and there was no shadow. This freaked me out, and I went pelting down the hallway and climbed into my parents' bed and refused to move because I saw something in the hallway. The next night, after all the lights are out, there's no weird shadow. I hear my mom getting ready to go to bed, and I call for her and watch that same shadow appear on the wall as she passes the bathroom, just like always. And she tucks me in and all, blah, blah, blah. I didn't see it again for a few nights, until I had another bad dream. Woke up in the middle of the night. There's the shadow in the hallway, and I think it's my mom for a second, and I feel like everything's okay, and I don't have to be scared. And then nothing happens, and I call out, and it's not my mom. I shout for my mom, and I see the shadow disappear, like the person casting it had gone past the bathroom nightlight the other way down the hallway, and then it reappears as my mom comes in to check on me. This happened a few times over the course of a couple months, always when I'd woken up from a bad dream, and it kept happening until I moved to a new house when I was 13. It's actually kind of funny though, because after I stopped being scared, because it wasn't actually my mom, it didn't feel ominous in any way, and I was never scared to hop out of my tall bed in the dark on nights I woke up and the shadow was there. It was almost always there when I had bad dreams, and on nights it wasn't there, I had a lot harder time falling back asleep, and my dreams tended to be worse. I kind of figured it was watching out for me while I slept, eventually. Not sure what it was, but I was the only person I knew at 12 and 13 who actually wanted to sleep with my bedroom door open, so I could see the shadow if I had a bad dream. This changed when we moved. The second week we were there, the playroom on the other side of my door, which should have been well lit from the streetlights and moonlight coming through the playroom windows and from my windows, was pitch black, with a sharp line of the ink black of the playroom, and the sort of normal nighttime gray of my bedroom in my doorway. And it was the scariest thing I've ever experienced. I never slept with my door open in that house after that.
Get off me. I woke up saying those exact words after a few seconds, and I instantly remembered why I'd said that. I was having sleep paralysis. There was a woman in the corner of my room and she was simply standing there. I tried to move, to turn on my light, but she was weighing me down. I struggled until I finally saw her move. She started walking towards me and I tried calling out my sister's name. I felt like I was suffocating and just wanted it all to stop. The woman was one step away and I could finally see her. Her face, or lack of. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just long hair and sharp nails. She's climbing on top of me and began tearing away my skin. I tried screaming for help. I tried moving to push her off me, but nothing worked. But the weird thing is she started molesting me. She put her hands inside me and I couldn't take it anymore and I wanted it all to stop. I slowly started regaining a little bit of movement, as well as my ability to speak. Although I'm sure it didn't take me too long to wake up, it felt like centuries. As soon as I woke up, I looked to my right, which was where my window was, and there she was. She stood outside of my window until she suddenly vanished. This happened in 2017, and the next time I saw her was in 2018. Except, I moved to a different house.
My grandfather died when I was in a very uncertain place in life. He didn't get to see me graduate college because I flunked out and worked garbage jobs for 2 to 3 years before getting my act together. He ended up getting mesothelioma and went from a fit and healthy old man to a skeleton clutching at his chest and gasping for air within the span of a month. I got to say my goodbyes before he was really far gone. I was afraid of hospitals, but I did go in and see him while he was still lucid, and I think he preferred I see him like that when I said my goodbyes, rather than the way my mom described him on his last few nights. We had that kind of mutual respect for each other and sense of privacy. That man always thought I was smart, even when I was failing school and making terrible choices. I was always his granddaughter and treated the same way with encouragement, F's on my report card or not. My grandparents' house was like a sanctuary when I was little. My mom had a lot of issues and I lived through 2 divorces and countless out-of-state moves, but I could always count on my time spent with my grandparents to be peaceful, until my grandmother's pain issues got really bad and she found, not so great, ways to cope with it. He also technically wasn't my biological grandpa, since my mom was adopted. It didn't matter. I'd go to their house and eat home-cooked meals and play Skip-Bo with him till like 10 p.m. when it was finally bedtime. So the point of that massive wall of text, I loved my grandfather. He was a rock for me. When he passed, I was upset, but he was in so much pain at the end, I was also relieved for him. He was taken too soon. But life's a bit and super unfair, so at least in that unfair end, he didn't suffer as long as some people do. After he passed, I started having dreams about him in their house. My grandmother had long passed by this point too. In them, we'd sit in the living room or at the kitchen table, and he would just talk to me about things in my life. I very distinctly remember a dream where he warned me to get away from the abusive boyfriend I was seeing at the time. As time went on, I got my act together, and now I live a relatively comfortable life. I'm not rich or super successful by any means, but given the life I had, I beat some odds, let's put it that way. There was a reason I failed out of middle school and all kinds of other things. And as these years have gone by, I've had less and less dreams about him. Now, I don't dream about him at all anymore. To date, my brother has had one dream about him when he was about to graduate college. An I'm so proud dream. It actually took me a long time to realize I don't dream about him anymore. I still dream about their house all the time, but it's always empty. I had one single dream about my grandmother, and it was in her kitchen making dinner with her back to me, which is a pleasant memory of how she was in life. I think the one dream from my grandmother was her saying goodbye, but all those dreams about my grandfather were him essentially watching over me. And as I got my life together, he realized he didn't need to anymore. So he either moved on or moved elsewhere. And that's why when I dream about their house, it's still because I remember it as a safe haven. But now it's empty, because they're gone and have moved on, which makes me happy and so terribly sad at the same time. But at the same time, if my grandpa was confident enough in me now to trust I'd be okay, I must be doing something right. So, I do firmly believe that loved ones can and do watch over people if they feel they're needed, and there was a strong bond while they were alive. Your rationalization makes complete sense too, but it might be okay to let yourself think you were protected by something unexplainable in that instant, especially if it comforts you in some way.
I've always had vivid dreams, but these few I remember when I was a kid are more weird. I was 6 to 8 when these started. I do have very vivid dreams, but none of these have ever felt the same. As I was young, I don't remember all the details, but the gist is that I would dream about a woman in a white dress in her mid-20s, I'd say. She was younger and had smooth arms. I could never see her face, but there was a man with her every time. He had blonde brown hair, a full beard, and I could see his face. He was dressed in white too. Pretty much normal humans, and we would be in the woods sometimes behind my house. After the first dream, I started having weird things happen in my sleep. Like one time I woke up. Well, I thought I was, but I couldn't move. But I knew I was being moved, and somehow I was under my bed, which wasn't that high off the ground, and had containers in front of me that had to move in order to get under my bed. Something was moving me, and I had no control. The dreams would continue for a year or more. I was still very young, but the last one happened. I remember being in the woods, and the woman and the man were there, and they were standing on the deck of a ship about to walk aboard, and there were lights, very bright. I think other people were on that ship, and I felt a presence, but don't remember seeing anything this time. My whole family was there, and the neighbors, which we were related to, meeting, and they were telling us thanks and goodbye. I have no idea why they seemed very grateful, and never dreamed of them again. I'm just really curious if anyone has had these types of dreams, or even seen these two in their sleep. I've always been curious, but never found an answer.
I'm a French 20-years-old guy who lives in a small city. I believe in the paranormal, and I am really interested in it. I had some sleep paralysis when I was young, but it stopped at approximately the age of 10. Since then, I have had no problem sleeping, rare nightmares, and absolutely no sleep paralysis. I'm not scared that easily, and I have never thought that the place where I would have the most scary experience in my life would be my girlfriend's house. So, yesterday, I went to sleep at my girlfriend's house. She just got a new bed from one of her cousins. She doesn't know him that much since her family just reunited about 1 year ago. It's been the first time I slept with her on that bed. I fell asleep. Here starts the dream. I dreamt about my girlfriend talking about a 5-year-old girl named Christina. I saw behind her the hand of a young child coming from behind the bed and waving at me. I didn't react, as I thought that it was Christina. I fell asleep in my dream just after that. Now starts the sleep paralysis. I wake up, and my girlfriend is not next to me as she should have been. I don't react first, as she often leaves to drink some water or go to the toilet. But after a few seconds, I felt cold in my back. Really cold. That kind of cold that makes you really uncomfortable, as if someone was touching you. Just after that, I heard a young girl's voice saying approximately this: "It was cold under the bed. I will come next to you." Besides the scare that I got, I suddenly felt really sad for no apparent reason, and I started to cry. I tried to move, but was completely paralyzed. I saw someone next to the room's window and tried to speak, thinking it was my girlfriend. No sound came out of my mouth. This paralysis ended when my girlfriend came back in the room about a minute later. I waited a little, really shocked, and still scared and sad about what just happened. When I explained everything to her, I cried again, like if something horrible happened. The weird thing is that the first thing I said, "Where did this bed come from? Do you know a Christina?" There was a stillborn baby next to me. I was sure that it was that, even if there was no clue of a stillborn baby in my nightmare or during my paralysis. What do you think about this? Do you think it is a good idea to talk about this dream to the cousin who gave her the bed? Has anyone had a similar experience?
Hey guys, it's Mort here and thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed tonight's video, and of course a huge thank you to Storytime Cinema for featuring tonight. I really hope you enjoyed our collaboration. If you did, he narrates scary stories over on his channel, and I've been informed that he is also going to start animated scary stories very soon. So if either of these things interest you, be sure to go over to his channel, follow the link on screen very soon and in the description to see what he produces. Excellent stuff. As always, I'd like to give a huge thanks to my patrons as well. Thank you so much for your very kind support. It really does mean a lot. If you'd like to join Patreon and help support the channel, the link, of course, can be found in the description. If there's a story that you would like to share with me, you can also send it to my email or post it to my Reddit page, both of which can be found in the description. And I did promise you Woods encrypted stories, and don't worry, they'll be out probably on Wednesday. Sorry for the delay. Alright then guys, for now, stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.